So we're going to go ahead and get started. You've got all your stuff ready, I'm assuming. I'm not going to take like massive attendance in like general. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is that my name is Andrews. I'm the Hierophant of the Church of Witchcraft. You'll hear a couple of different people sort of voice in as well. Ember is one of our cardinals, and we have Gwen over here, a new deacon as well. Yep, she's helping me with the guest stuff as well. So I practice celestial witchcraft. And that's basically just think of astrology on steroids. It's the easiest way to consider that. I'm sure some of you have heard me say the spiel time and time again, but it's helpful for people out there. Also, hello, everybody on YouTube that might be watching this or whatever platform you might have found this on. We're glad to have you here and listening. So I have been sigil work is what we're going to be talking about today specifically. And during all of these, feel free to voice in or chime in if you want to, or if there's things that you want to say. I try to make this more collaborative and involved. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. We'll try and get to you and make sure those questions get asked and get answered as well. Any questions thus far? Just see a bunch of muted microphones. I'm going to take that as a no. So today we're going to be talking about sigil magic specifically. Sigil magic comes in a lot of different forms, and you'll see this in a variety of places, and we'll talk some more about that history as well. Sigil magic takes a big role within my own witchcraft. So the celestial witchcraft that I do has benefited significantly from using sigils. And it's one of those ones that you can sort of get your hands in and get, into the thick of it with this stuff. So it can be a very involved process, or it can be a very simplified process. And that will sort of make more sense later on. We will also be doing some sigil work, and I'll be encouraging that too during this. So we're going to do some different forms later on, so that you can get kind of a feel for what sigils are for you, or if there's something that you want to incorporate. In our history, in just human history in general, we see the role of iconography. Iconography are just basic fancy word for icons that mean something to whatever culture it happens to be in. Before then, you're dealing with things in the phenomenological realm, physical realm, that sort of stuff. So when you see like a striped yellow and black creature that's buzzing around, you generally know danger, stay away, right? That's a form of iconography. And so some of those correspondences can come into play with that. Iconography is things that help us direct us, like in traffic, for example. You can find iconography across the world. It's a way that we use symbols to impart meaning. You'll see a lot of that within alchemy as well. And within that alchemical stuff, you'll see different shapes. You'll see things like circles that mean things, or triangles that mean certain things. So iconography plays a big role in how we navigate this realm, this physical realm. And Maureen, did you have anything that you wanted to say?
No, no, I'm good.
Cool. Just checking to make sure that anybody has any question.
Thank you.
Okay. And feel free to, have your video on or off. It's up to whatever you would like that to look like for you. So iconography falls into two major categories of how we articulate things to ourselves and to each other. We see things in the forms of semantics and syntax. Semantics and syntax are going to take a big role in this. It just happens within our language. Semantics essentially refer to the meaning of things, whether it's symbols or words or characters, and this goes back to that iconography, right? If we see the symbol of X marks the spot, for example, that's a symbol, that's an icon, and has some sort of semantic meaning to it. The syntax is the construction of your semantics. So the way that I'm talking right now is the syntax of the semantic words that you know, right? So all of our English vocabulary that we have has semantic meaning. The syntax then structures and ropes all those things together in a particular way. If you use syntax that doesn't match or is out of order, it sounds strange, and people will definitely pick up on that. This is why you can sort of know if somebody's from a particular area, because their syntax doesn't necessarily match your own. They'll use things like, they'll use pop or soda as an example. The semantics that are more commonly used for those words mean the same thing, but the syntax is going to be different. the way that semantics and syntax also incorporate within our articulation has to do with the neurolinguistic programming. Big fancy word, basically brain instructions, and it has to do with brain language instructions specifically. So neuro, brain, linguistic, language, and then your programming instructions. And you can imagine now, if you link together iconography, semantics and syntax with how you program what you see, what you hear, what you're speaking with. So in our sigil examples, I'm going to steal that real quick.
Sure.
Does anybody, while I find this, does anybody have any examples of sigils in their own lives?
Wouldn't kind of religious symbols count?
Yeah, those are, most of them are in there, and they may not necessarily fall in the role of sigil. It depends on what we mean, but we'll get to more definitions of sigil later. I would argue yes.
Okay, what about runes, for example, then?
Yeah,
would runes count as cool?
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to mention runes, but then he said it, so.
Oh, my bad.
See where I get to all that breakdown. We get there a little bit later.
Or
Just
even like
like-
astrological symbols, you know, utilizing like an ephemeris, you know, and utilizing like the symbology that typically represents the planetary, you know, astrological symbolism to kind of incorporate that within your sigils that you create, or even using like the pattern that's like the 9 letters, where you do like you assign a letter to each number, or
Yes.
and then kind of go that way. So
Yep. And we'll break down that a little bit further on. Do you have something, Gwen?
Like just regular like letters?
Regular letters would be in there. So there's a lot of pieces to how, like, where sigils come from. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen real quick. Let's see here. Can you see this? So I can't see any of you. So anybody can see that?
I can
Image?
see the folder open, and one of the images is highlighted.
Then let me do this. Let's see here. We're still learning Zoom after 3 years, right?
Technology.
This will work. Now.
I think they did a big update, so everything's changed.
I can see it now. It says the Hunter Bind rune.
Yep, good, cool. So these are, and I'll go into these a little bit more, but these are examples of sigils that we'll see and we'll do some conversation about. I know this one's a little bit tight to see. There we go. I can get this to zoom back out. More examples of sigils, right? This one we're going to talk about too in just a little bit, and this is also referencing some of the Icelandic staves or runes, the other Futhark. Some more examples. There's a lot of ways to incorporate sigils into craft. I see that we have a message of some iteration. Let's see here.
People were saying yes to seeing it.
Oh, good. Now I can see it. Chat, please close. There we go. And I'm going to put this on speaker because I remember this from last recording. Move this one. There we go. Okay, so those are some of the examples of our sigils. I will go into those more. I know that was really brief, but it's just to give you an idea of what sigils can look like. And they do come in a lot of different varieties. When I talk about phenomenology, it's a very big, silly word, basically. What it means is that it comes from philosophy. And it's essentially, if you consider the experience of, say, the redness of an apple, or the color of a specific thing, this in the phenomenological field, the plane of existence of material qualities, and so how you experience them. So sigils exist within that phenomenological plane of reality. It's how we experience magic. It's that feeling that we have. So when we talk about when I mentioned some of the mystery schools, the mystery tradition that they have, that mystery is about what magic feels like to them. And it's within that phenomenological scope, how magic physically feels in one's body and how it is represented. And so when you're thinking about using sigils for their application, which I'll get into in a little bit, it's all that phenomenological piece. How I feel, what it cues in my brain, what things I'm gaining from that, what are my senses experiencing from this sigil itself. It provides intention to our experience. So it means that the redness of an apple says something, just like if we think about that hornet that I was talking about earlier, the yellow and black has some intention to that experience. I see this thing in the phenomenological plane, the material realm, and it means something. So it has intention to that experience. So I have an experience of something and it provides that intention, and I'm able to access that. And similarly, this attaches to how we work with sigils. I'm not going to go way down the rabbit hole on this, but 4E philosophy, which I know Gwen knows so much about now. She's so tired of hearing me talk about it. Look it up. It's going to be a really long explanation. I'm going to go very briefly. The 4E type of philosophy says that an entity must be embodied, so I have to have some sort of physical form. It's extended into the environment. We are able to enact in some way, and that we're embedded within our culture. So that means that the 4Es are embodied, extended, enacted, and embedded. These four aspects to this philosophy, how minds work, is attached to, like I said, the experience of like the redness of an apple, what magic actually feels like when you're interacting with it and working with it. And to be embodied is to be able to have the sensory experience of what that magic is. You can extend out into the world by using that feeling to inform decisions and to make manifestation and creation externally to yourself, or as we've talked about before, the focus that's in there. You're extending your intention outwards. You're enacting some sort of set of instructions, and it's attached to that programming that I was talking about earlier. So by enacting a certain thing, that would be the instructions of what the sigil is in this particular example, is what's helping inform me of what my behavior is going to be. And I'm embedded within the culture of either those symbols, the icons, the groups that I'm working with, whatever that happens to be. So I'm embedded in that, and I'm within that stream of that magic that I'm working within that sigil creation. And I know that's a lot I just threw at you. So those aspects are helping inform what sigil work does and why it works and how you would engage with it. So sigil magic incorporates semantics and syntax within a phenomenological field, contributing to 4E consciousness, basically. So I do sigils and I make them, and it has some sort of meaning and some sort of structure. So the meaning would be whatever the instruction is. The syntax would be the arrangement of the symbols or the icons within that, or the letters, and it's within the material plane, and it is engaged with by that those 4Es that are in that. I'll give you a second to write down any notes that you wanted to for that. Sigils are a meaning articulation for a purpose or intent. That's the phenomenology, right? So sigils produce a meaning, that it has a meaning, and it's articulated by the sigil itself. You looking for anybody that has their...
No.
Cool. So now we sort of have an idea of where sigils exist and what their intent and function is, and where we get some of that from. So where does sigil magic originate? Some of the history of sigils, they've been around, at least they've been widespread since the Neolithic era, or basically late Stone Age. So they've used iconography and sigils for meaning making, meaning articulating, and even for magical purposes as well. Don't ask me what specific culture, just so it does exist in a number of cultures. Fast forwarding quite a bit, we get to the Chinese turtle. So the Chinese turtle, the story basically went that somebody that had gone down to a river, a tortoise had come out of the water, and it had symbols on its back. And this was related to the Chinese Kameas. More specifically, Bagua, Bagua, which I believe is the other word used for Kamea. These two things are related to the feng shui aspects in Taoism for trigrams and hexagrams. And they have different patterns that are used for meaning making. Fast forwarding a little bit more, we get into the medieval era. The medieval era, we get a hold of the thing called the Keys of Solomon. I'm sure plenty of people have heard of the Keys of Solomon. It comes in a number of different books that have various sigils within them. Those sigils are related to 72 demons, and as well as angels, and starts incorporating some of these magic squares, or the kameas. So that was something that, I don't remember which one was actually saying that, but the kameas are a magic square, basically. So think like magical Sudoku. The vertical and horizontal lines have to equal the same number. So if it was 15, for example, each line, each row would add to 15 at the end. Each column would be 15, and the diagonal would also be referenced as the same number. That's what truly makes it a magic square, that it all adds up to this. This is important because in the future, as we're getting past the medieval era, we get into some of the other ceremonial magic that uses these things for planetary magic, and they use different sigils based on the names of the planets translated into Hebrew numbers. So basically, they took the name of a planet, then they took the numbers that correspond to that, then those numbers were translated to the Hebrew numbers system, and then those were drawn out over the magic square itself. I do have examples of this, and I will give those with this in the description, so this will become available and easy to see. You can look up magic squares, and you'll find these pretty easily also. And those are what makes the basis, those magic squares are the basis of some of the planetary magic and sigils that they were using within the Order of the Golden Dawn, as well as some of the other Western occult systems. You don't see these, you also, like I said, you see these a lot in Chinese or Eastern mysticism, Eastern esotericism, but it was very prominent within the Order of the Golden Dawn, the Lima, and going forward. We get even more modern when we get to Austin Osman Spare, and he talks about curating entities within yep, that each one of these sigils that is created is an underlying substructure of the brain. So it's representative of a function of the brain, which is somewhat what I kind of considered when I was thinking about the 72 seals that Solomon had made, and had referenced these demons, kings and dukes of hell, and so on and so forth, that they were really just proto-psychology almost, that they were used as a reference point for a specific type of psychology that was going on, and that you would interact or interface with that in a more physical way. Spare gives us some of that thinking as well, from creating these representative sigils that become their own entity. This is important because that leads us into more of our modern chaos magic. In chaos magic, they also talk about servitors and egregores. I'm not going to go into a long description of these things, but basically they are an icon, the meaning of articulation. There's a sigil that represents a specific thing, and that is on an individual level, meaning servitor, more often used as an individual component. An egregore would be that of group consciousness making group mind. I'm going to steal that keyboard real quick. Let's see here. I'm going to go back to sharing the screen, and so you can see, where's the... This is the chaos magic sigil, basically. This I would consider an egregore of its own creation, because so many of the chaos magicians, witches, occultists know this symbol, and these are some of the meanings that go for these 8-path direction. This 8-path direction, with a combination of all of the occultists, the people who use this path, give this thing more meaning, being its own entity. essentially, and it manifests as a psychological entity that all of them share and reference, and it becomes its own idea and representation. We're gonna have to jump back and forth with that too. So the Chaos Magicians also pulled over one of the things that you'll hear pretty commonly is that when a sigil is made, that we should make the sigil and then completely forget about it, bury it in our conscious. We shouldn't be able to access that. We should just make it and forget it, and it should be back into that kind of programming. This comes from Spare initially. The Chaos Magicians basically took it a step further, and it became more centralized to that subconscious implanting of a symbol. I'm not going to go into various layers of consciousness. You can look that up on your own, but basically implanting that at a subconscious level makes it more active, and it's part of that manifestation. It's part of that creation because you're subconsciously programming yourself to respond to that sigil. And that's where we kind of get to more of our contemporary sigils that we have today. It's a mixture of all of these components where how you make your own sigils will be dependent on which one of these resonates with you, which one makes the most sense. I'm going to try them all. There's a lot of different applications that I will talk about in a minute, more than a minute. As Travis had reminded us that runes are one of those things. Now I'm going to steal the keyboard again. I just have to hang on to it. So runes are one of those things that are really good for sigils. And I'll give you an example of those once it gets there. Are you really going to fight me on this? Okay, so this is an example of a bind rune. This is using the Elder Futhark specifically. Futhark is Futhark. It is so named as the Futhark because of the initial letters that begin the Elder Futhark library, basically, that alphabet in that itself. The first one is, and they all match up with that. There's a series of 24 different runes. In this, you'll be able to see that there are various iterations of this. So this image specifically gives us a better idea. So Uruz, for the strength to go, is seen within this. And I don't think this one outlines it, but I'll show you another one that does. Forward and last until the prey is found. So this is explaining how these are. So Feo is in this stave, right, coming all the way up and down, and right here. So this is part of that first rune, Feho. You'll see Fehu and Feo. Kanaz is this big diagonal right there. So this big guy, this one, is Kanaz. And then you have Uruz. I'm looking for it's right here. This in shape is Uruz. And please check me on this. I'm trying to just remember it. It's been a while. Iwaz is also seen in this, and I believe it's this shape. Raido means for travel, and it's this R shape. And so you can see how the bind runes start forming together. And to make this kind of a sigil and this meaning. And so when you're asking what specifically should I do, what sigils exist, which ones should I copy, which ones mean a certain thing, they're very much a creation of the individual witch or occultist or magician that's using those symbols. You can find various works that are bind runes, but making your own is going to, being familiar with this kind of a process that we're talking about today will help you develop your own sigils that have your own semantic syntax and meaning articulation within that. And so that is part of that application that we're talking about. One of the symbols that is fairly, we'll talk, before I get to that one, this is another example. So a linear bind rune, you can read this of your own accord. I'll leave this up for a minute, but you're seeing the first rune, which is right here. Should be Thala, I believe. And then Dagaz is right here, the one that looks kind of like a bow tie. This one should be Isa and Hagalaz. They have different meanings, but they're binding them together and they look like this. So that's one way of how you combine runes together. It's not the only way. There's a lot of different ways you can stack them, you can rotate them, and that we'll see later on in the Practical Sigil Magic book that I will give you the reference to in a little bit. But Practical Sigil Magic will go through this specifically. Fast forwarding to these guys. Has anybody ever seen these before?
Yes.
Right? Thanks, Gwen. So the Ayas Kilmer on the left-hand side there is the helm of awe or the helm of terror. It's to induce fear to protect against abuse of power. There is no historic accurate model for the Ayas Humor. It doesn't exist. It's spoken of within the Poetic Eddas, the list of poems of all of the valorous things that happen. They mention the Ayas Humor, but this shape doesn't have a historic basis. If you have contention with that, I can show you a video that also from a professor of history that knows about these things that understands why this doesn't exist. But this doesn't necessarily have no meaning. It still has meaning. You'll see this in a lot of different places. The theory goes that basically the Helm of Awe was supposed to be that shape, that symbol, a sigil, that actually puts together the rune Algiz, A-L-G-I-Z. Algiz is representative of the elk, which symbolize protection and power and strength. And it's a combination of 8 of those, if I counted that correctly. So it has an 8 staves of the Algiz rune. And it's so put together for that reason. As a modern symbol, arguably modern, by modern I mean with less than 1,000 years, you won't see this. There's something similar to it, but it doesn't necessarily exist. But it still has meaning because you are giving the semantics and the syntax to those symbols within the library of those runic staves. We had to look at the original runic staves when we were looking at how you put those together. This is one way that they put this together. The one on the right-hand side, the Vegvisier, is signpost, it's guidance, it's those pieces, and it's also a magical stave. That one does have more historic basis, but the other one does not have as much of a historic basis to it. They still have meaning nonetheless. Might have to hang on to this while I take these things.
Sounds good.
We'll just have to get 2 keyboards.
There we go.
So that's one method that you'll see of how to use Icelandic staves or the Elder Futhark to create runes. That's where I started with much of my own practice. There's an example. It's Ralph Bloom, R-A-L-P-H space B-L-U-M. Ralph Bloom is not great for the book for runes, is not fantastic for history. It's really good as a reference material. And it does list all of the runes out in a meaningful way that is based in the historic Poetic Eddas, so on and so forth. So I would use that as a reference material. There's a couple other books that are better for that, but not about runes, just about sigils in general. The Ogham, O-G-H-A-M, when we get further south, you start seeing that in the Welsh, Scottish, Irish, Germanic, Gaulish sort of pantheon of belief in occultism. The Ogham runes are basically a stick language used mostly by the Druids, and those were bound in certain ways, and they had different ideographs. Ideographs reference Chinese symbology. So the Chinese letters, they're an ideogram. Basically, they're a sequence of shapes that represent a concept. Similarly, the Ogham does that. All of the sigils do, and arguably most of the lettering, including the English alphabet and pretty much any alphabet that exists, can be arranged in a certain way, and those certain ways could arguably be made into a sigil or have some sort of meaning behind them, ergo the semantics and syntax. When we switch consonants, we get to, and I'm going to pronounce this terribly, but the Vive or Veve, V-E-V-E, and that is from voodoo or voodooans and specifically, and it's a way to access the Iwa or the gods of that specific occultism or that specific tradition. It is a beacon to those deities themselves. So the Vive, I'm just going to go with Vive because that's my phonetic brain. It's V-E-V-E. There's no apostrophes over them, so I'm assuming it just means it says it's pronounced Vive. Could be incorrect. But it is a beacon to the Iwa, and they would use this within their rituals, within their seances, within their practice, within all of those things to bring the Iwa into their ceremonies, which oddly sounds very similar to Solomonic magic. So the 72, when we were referencing the Keys of Solomon, the 72 demons that we were talking about are using the specific setup of, let's see here. It is within So this is one example of Gujin. Gujin is one of the demons that is listed within the Ars Goetia. There's 5 of them. The Ars Goetia is basically the demonic manual. The Ars Paulina is that for angels, but this is the sigil for this specific demon that was referenced within the Keys of Solomon. It was used in this specific setup. This is the Lesser Key of Solomon. The magician or practitioner would be here in the center, and you can go a lot of different ways with this. And then this triangle was where the demon was basically focused into and would manifest into and would be lashed to that specific place and be controlled. And this is where we're getting to some of that ceremonial magic. But this sounds really similar to that voodoo and tradition of bringing in the Iwa as a beacon. This also is part of some of that, and I can see where that crossover happens, which is why we have to talk about all of these different traditions from different regions to get a better idea of why people use the way they do. And this is also going to relate to our application here in a minute. So like I said, this Lesser Key of Solomon, practitioners would be down here, demon would be up here. They have different functions and powers. Namely, the demons that are within the Key of Solomon are going to be things like secret knowledge, knowledge of language and letters, artistic prowess, finding things that are hidden, giving power or motivation. It's those kinds of things. You can look it up. It's a free book. You can easily get them online. Okay. So these are all great to know. Now we have some of what a sigil is, where they come from, what cultures use them, how we see them, the historicity of those as well. And we're going to now look at a library of symbols. So we have this library of symbols. And what I mean by library of symbols could be anything from an alphabet to Enochian, could include... Did I get into that one yet? I was one card off. So the library of symbols, like we were talking about beforehand, Hebrew is very common within Western esotericism. You'll see that all over the Order of the Golden Dawn, OTG. You'll see Aramaic. You'll see that in the tradition of some of the star, like the Zoroastrianism, Aramaic sort of stuff. You'll see some of the symbols within there. Theban, the witch's alphabet, and I'm not even going to try to remember the person that came from this. I know it, but it's not in my head at the moment. It's part of a codex that basically was about encoding words, and it was to hide or obfuscate knowledge. And they did that through a Theban. So it was basically just an easy cipher. So it was between, one symbol represents another symbol, and then it was its own code. So just like the Enigma machine, when they were trying to encode messages, very similar to that in Theban specifically. And that's its own library of symbols. Astrology, like was mentioned before, the symbols of the planets within astrology, the transits within that. So conjunction, square, trine, semi-quincunx, semi-conjunction, quincunx, all of those pieces are part of that symbolic library. Numerology is going to play a very heavy role, specifically across most occult traditions. Numerology takes a very front and center seat to many of those things. You'll find it all over the tarot, readings and cards. You'll see that within astrology. You'll see that in all of Order of the Golden Dawn. You'll see that in Thelema. It's very common to see those, and it's very useful to know numerology, or at least some basic principles of that when you're working with planetary squares. So the planet of, the planetary square of, say, Jupiter, Neptune, the moon, the sun, they all have different operations. And for whatever operations you're trying to do, think about the correspondences. So correspondences of the moon would be things like emotion. So maybe it's related to motion that you would use the planetary square of the moon within that grid that it looks like to devise a sigil for that specific operation. That's why the planetary squares have the meaning within that system specifically. Hieroglyphs are another one that also are literally sigils. I was talking also about the Chinese ideograms that are used to depict their own language and their own alphabet of symbols. It was a composite of many ideas into one character that represented an idea, which is why it's very hard for us to understand, because they're basically making a bunch of sigils for their language. English, and basically any alphabet will do this as well. Sador squares, All right, that's going to get into that in just a second here. You will also see this, another library that would be very common to know is alchemy. So alchemical symbols, symbols for gold, symbols for lead, tin, yada, yada, yada. They'll be also very commonly used. Alchemical symbols are also used very heavily within sacred geometry. So I think I can find that in here. The working of alchemy and creating the things, if anybody's familiar with Full Metal Alchemist, they actually use some of the principles within actual alchemy within their show. Not 100%, but it's present. I can set this up for other people, but basically the sacred geometry relies on some of those alchemical principles. So triangles are things to break things down. So using a triangle. And if you're thinking about inverted versus upright, that can also provide different meaning within that. So if you're going to break things down, you're breaking down the sphere, are you breaking down the earth? Are you breaking down both? Such as the Star of David has 2 triangles in it. Just saying. Squares are to construct things, which obviously makes sense within a lot of our structures. We see a lot of squares. Pentagons are for physical energies, working with physical energies. Hexagons are elements and combine the constructive pieces as well as the destructive properties of living things. So hexagons have their own meaning. An octagon is about living energy or magic. The nonagon, 9-sided shape. It's the world at a fundamental level and is paired with a monogram, so a single symbol, right? So if I have a 9-sided shape, you'll have a triangle breaking it down, or maybe you want to use a square. So combining these aspects is making its own sigil of those alchemical symbols. So knowing those is going to help you create some of that sacred geometry. And sacred geometry took it to a whole new level. Really involved incorporating numerology, incorporating sigil work, incorporating alchemical principles, a whole bunch of different things. The reason that I say that you should have a large library of symbols, if you only possess your native alphabet, for example, you're only going to have those symbols that have any meaning, right? So the way you structure words with those letters brings a certain meaning. But if you increase the amount of symbols that you have, the easier it's going to be to create more, to be able to manifest and meaning make with those symbols to provide the intention to the sigil that you're creating. Specifically for me, I use a combination of Theban, of the Elder Futhark, the runes that we were talking about with the Icelandic staves. I will use principles of alchemy within that, and I will also use astrology within that. And I am embarking on using the planetary squares, so the 7 major planets that were back then that were recognized that we had are going to have their own planetary squares and their own meaning and the own operations for each one of those planets at certain times. And this goes into a way, this is just broad strokes because this gets super deep and super complicated really quickly, and you don't need all of that information. Again, these are jumping off points for people. Been talking for a bit. I just wanted to make sure if anybody had any questions or anything that they would like to say.
Just real quick, I was writing down the like with the triangle, square, pentagon, everything represented. I missed the circle.
End with no beginning. So origin point would be the way, and I don't believe that I had circle in that one, but usually it's translated as an origin point. So think of the Ouroboros, right? Snake eating its own tail. Think of the beginning and end of all things, the genesis point of something.
Okay, thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. All right, then I'm going to go ahead and continue on. Did I hit that marker again, Gwen?
Mhm.
Okay, that should catch me almost all the way up. Other places that you will see some of this is in, so for history reasons, you'll also see this within Abramelin the Mage's book, specifically in book 3 in the French version, book 4 in the German translation. He uses letters instead of numbers within the magic square itself. So he has his own ciphers and those sorts of things that fit within an either even-sided square or an uneven, odd-numbered sided square. And then we also see Sator squares. Sator squares are in Rome, and Rome used Sator squares, which is essentially just the same thing as a magic square, just from a Roman perspective. The OTG also would evolve that into the planetary squares, like I was talking about earlier. Pretty quick, easy way to do that. The seventh book by Israel Regardi, the seventh edition of the OTG, is a book that I'm pointing to over here that you can't see, but it's a giant book, basically. It's like 1,000 pages long or something, and has really good, it shows these images specifically of the planetary squares. Also, the resources that I'll provide here in a little bit will also help you make those planetary squares, because for me, it gets a little complicated, especially when we're trying to do complicated math to make these planetary squares. Doesn't need to be super complicated, and there's an easy way to do it, and I will share that. Sigils also are seen as hexagrams and trigrams. The trigrams in China are specifically used within to determine the natural phenomena, and they were originally referencing the entire scope of a hexagram from each one of the trigrams. Represents sky, earth, thunder, wind, water, fire, mountain, and lake. And it was a way for them to demonstrate their known world by using the sigil and this image itself. Again, it's one of those things you're going to have to look up and just take a gander at. You'll see these often used within talismanic magic, so making talismans. These would be things you can charm that would be using the operations of those sigils within a specific worn item or an enchanted item of some kind, or an area that you could, and you can look and reference. I'm going to say it again, the spell map will also kind of go into what these things mean as well. So they'll break down charm, enchant, jinx, hex, and curse. And within those, you can use sigils to perform the operations of those based on principles from correspondence within the sigil work that you're doing. Starting to see where these are getting pretty layered and can get very complex very rapidly. Common uses or common development of the sigils themselves. There's a substitution, where you substitute one letter for another letter. So one library symbols for another library symbols, however you want to do that, whether that's numerology, you can do that with any number of divination practices to determine which ones are going to be substituted. The kameas, or the planetary squares, kamea, bagua, and planetary squares are all the same thing, just as a side note. You may remove all of the doubles in this as well. So if you have double letters of any iteration, so if you have a specific statement, which I'm going to go ahead and talk about here in just a second. So if you have, I want money, right? For example, the double N would be dropped. You wouldn't have two N's, you'd only have the one N, for example, as an example. So when you're dropping doubles, you may drop vowels, you may drop, different components of that for different reasons. This principle, I think, stems from specifically when you were talking about wow, now I have to think back in my head, dropping those letters, with the substitution within the planetary squares using the Hebrew numeral sequence. They will simplify, for example, the number 5 for 500, the symbol that says 500. They'll simplify that down to 50, or they'll simplify 50 down to 5. And by that simplification, that is echoed in the future when we're dropping doubles within words or statements, or if we're dropping vowels. It is very similar in principle. I think that's where it originally started from, is by minimizing the numbers themselves when using a magic square. Specific ways that I will use this, and this will help us also see, we're going to go back to our images here. All right, in this guy, this is a sigil creation wheel. So you're basically taking the library of Elder Futhark, and then you're putting them into this particular shape. It doesn't have to be these specific angles. It could just be rounded edges. It doesn't really matter. But this is one way that you can do it. So each one of these, if you had a specific statement with using this alphabet, you would draw a line. Can anybody see my mouse? I'm not sure. I'm going to go with no on that.
Yes,
so
we can see your mouse. My bad. I
Okay,
forgot
cool.
you couldn't see us.
Yeah. The so this one right here, right? If we draw a line from this and then the next letter and then another letter and then another letter, you're bringing the line down. So you're drawing out these lines themselves to create the sigil. And that pattern of lines is then stylized and then used as the specific way to create that. I generally will use this kind of a wheel system to create that. This is another example using the English alphabet, and you'll see a better example here of those specific things. So if we look at this, you'll see that there's money, health, luck, and joy. And so let's look at joy, since it's probably the simplest one. So you can see the shape, right? So 1, 2, 3, 3 letters, J-O-Y, right? J to the O to the Y. That would be pulled out, and then this line work right here, let's not even go that far. This one on the far right is that same symbol that we're saying of J, O, and Y, and that can be then stylized and turned into its own sigil. It looks pretty simple, but if you start combining these things, I want joy, or I am looking for joy, or I give joy, you can combine those into a more complex sigil, the complex line work, based on the wheel that's right here using the English language. This could be Theban, this could be Enochian, it could be Hebrew, it could be any number of things, or it could be your own division of letters as well. Did you have something?
Did someone like create this wheel, or is it just like can you create your own wheel with like the different order of how the letters are?
You can change the order of these letters as is needed. I mean, the creation of the creativity in witchcraft is really prominent here. How you develop these can be done in a number of ways. It could be done by numerology. It could be done by scrying. You know, maybe you say, all right, I have this subset of letters. Should I put them in the upper right or the upper left? Should it be internal? Should it be external, right? And that creativity is what can piece together this wheel. One evolution of this is that I will use a wheel like this in English, and then I will use a wheel like this at the same time, and I will actually overlap the two of them, and I will use multiple wheels to create multiple meanings within sigil work, and I will continue to layer those to create its own specific programmed sigil. And now it gets kind of into our application. So the wheel system is one way to do that. Your planetary squares is another way to make that sigil. I may have an example of that. The operations that you're seeing in this guy. So this is a sword, obviously. This is from an occultist friend of mine. And this is actually the seal of Mars. So it's about the operation of Mars, which is that war bringer. And so they applied this Mars planetary sigil to the weapon that is being used for that purpose. So if you have an athame, for example, perhaps it would be for openings or spiritual gateways, and you can make a sigil based on the library symbol that you might be using, or whatever that might look like, whether it's a wheel, whether it's substitution. There's a lot of different ways to go about creating those sigils, but then you can apply those into your own witchcraft on your altars, clothes, pattern sequences. It's really just up to the individual how complex they want to get. This is a sigil for Jupiter, planetary sigil of Jupiter, and this has its own meaning from the same occult friend also. And you'll see echoes, like right here, Athala. Here's another one at the top for Dagas. This is an alchemical symbol as well. This too represents an alchemical symbol. And so there's a combination of many factors from different libraries being used to make this center sigil and to activate what this is. Other than sigils, putting together semantic syntax meaning, this is a bind spell base that's done on 2 different knives using sigil work as well. If you notice right here, looks like Mercury, doesn't it? And it's combined with another rune, right? So there's many ways to combine different libraries and their symbols. I'm going to zoom back in on that. So
It just looked like they used the Theban alphabet. If you move that way. Yeah.
Yep. So you're seeing some of the Theban. So here's some astrology, Taurus. You're seeing some of the Theban, and that's going to be this guy right here as one example. Not familiar with this symbol. You'll find most of this within Solomonic magic, talisman work. So this is an example of a talisman that could be made. And you're seeing how runes and different symbols can be combined to create certain effects. And it's along the blade for different purposes. Let's see here. This is also their creation method. So they're putting all these symbols together and then arranging them in a certain way to provide a certain type of meaning for that specific operation. All right, I'm going to stop that share again. Sigils are a very powerful way to like I said, for that meaning, articulation, the phenomenological field, via that 4E kind of consciousness, that internal guidance. What time are we at? Because I can't actually read that.
28.
Wow. This gets really complicated, so I'm going to have to burn through this pretty fast. Thankfully, we're really close to the end here. So we might go a little bit over, not very much. Application. Now you have a lot of, at least a pretty good idea of what sigils are and why they exist, where they came from, and some of the way to make them and how to craft them yourself for your own magical operations within your witchcraft. So in terms of application, the term sigil comes from the Latin word sigillum, which means seal. So you'll see a lot of sigils used for seals on objects. So whether it's a cursed box, or if you want to break something down, this is something that you can incorporate within your 3 C's. So cleanse, consecrate, and charge. If you have a fancy box, I just happen to have a fancy box right here. Fancy box, right? Inside of this, I could put a tarot deck or a magical tool, or maybe something that I want to dispel or break down, right? And I could make a sigil, and I could attach it to the top of this box and make this a sealed box for that specific operation, just as one example. I can give you a number of examples, but there's just an infinitude of ways of making sigils and seals. But I could seal this box to cleanse, consecrate, and charge. Maybe I use the alchemical principle of a triangle, for example, and make a geometric shape for that is intended for breaking something down that's within this. So things like that might be cursed or hexed or enchanted for destructive purposes, or maybe there's something you want to remove from your own life. That's things that you can use seals for within boxes like this. Use your imagination on this as well.
Like for an example, like I have a jar that I will cleanse crystals in there, and I have like cleansing sigils drawn onto that jar as well. Yeah, something like that I've like painted the sigils on.
These are things you can place. I don't recommend it. And I also, the jury is out for me on deities, and I've said this plenty of times before. If you do think deities are a physical manifestation, or that they can become physically manifest, you could theoretically trap them in sort of an object, for example, and use a seal for that. I don't recommend this course of action for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to get into why, but just use your imagination, right? If you were trapped in a small little box, I'm pretty sure you'd not be super happy about it either. And also don't forget that these things don't have to have an empty void in the middle like a jar or a box does. You could literally, you will see this on the magicians as an example, they used a piece of wood that had a symbol on it, and that is a particular type of seal that they crafted for that, and they trapped something within that. So it doesn't necessarily have to have a void inside of it. But as with anything that has a doorway, if it can get in, there has to be a way to get out. That's how doors work, obviously. I know, super shocking. A lot of people forget this in magical operations. I'm going to put something into this thing, but it also means it can get out of the thing. So just bear that in mind when you're crafting some of these. And I talked a little bit about this with in another post that I was thinking, where it was, if you're going to seal or trap something, damage or erase the seal, the thing that make the doorway basically go away. Or maybe you put another sigil on top of that. So you have the first one that would be a seal, and then the second one on top of that, which would be the, this can be no longer unlocked, as an example. So just bear in mind that these things they go both ways. Don't say it. So bindings and barriers are very common within that sigil or that seal from Latin. This is also about intention setting. So you can put symbols around that you have created, whether they're on doors, whether they're on cars, whatever they are. Your worn objects, tattoos, can all be forms of intention setting. Sacred spaces, for example. So when you're making or casting a circle, or when I cast a veil, I can use those, I can use sigils for that as well. And I can create certain shapes for certain operations that I want to use, magically speaking. So sigils have a variety of uses, and get creative with it. Very specifically for me, I also incorporate sigil work within wand work. So wand movements, for example. So a lot of Wiccan books will say, hey, we want, to use a wand to direct energy. That's great. I wanted to build on that. And so from some of the Welsh witchcraft, so Cornish witchcraft specifically, Cornish Book of Ways is the reference that I'll give you. It's the Cornish Book of Ways. Within that, it tells you how to use a wand. They have a blasting wand made out of blackthorn, I want to say. It's a blackthorn wand. Yeah. And it's, anyways, basically they use wands for different things other than just directing energy. But you can also, what I realized was that you can use sigils, the shapes that we made, those line diagrams that I was showing you from the wheel. If I want to say cast focus or cast, you know, sacred space, perhaps I make a sigil for that, and then that line pattern is the pattern that the wand will move in. So using wand work paired with sigil work. Sigils can also be used as an anchor or that beacon, like I was speaking about with the voodooing as well. So I've used sigils within meditative states, so transcendent meditative states, to put a specific symbol on a door within that space. I then tried to find that same symbol in my dream state, and I could find the two, so it can act as an anchor or beacon as well, not just for other deities, but also for the self. Sigil for your house might also help as a recall for that, you know, specific location. For individuals as well. You will also see sigils used for summoning. So like in the Keys of Solomon, you'll see summonings of demons into that triangle at the top. That was a way to use a sigil or a seal to seal the demon into a specific thing to ask for a specific operation or a thing that you wanted. Fellow coven member also uses sigils on bodies, for example. So they'll use sigils to seal certain pieces of themselves. I have the Ias Humor on this shoulder, actually, to seal this arm because it kept getting injured, and I wanted protection on this arm, and lo and behold, this arm doesn't get very injured anymore. This one gets injured all the time. But that's its own thing. So you can use sigils on the body. You can tattoo them on. You can use henna as an example, as a more temporary option as well for a specific operation. Think about using sigils that are made on the body that are temporary, and then going into a ritual space with those on you and sanctifying the first altar or yourself as well. So there's a lot of ways that you can incorporate different sigils for different purposes. And finally, I know I just breezed through all of that, but finally, resources that are really helpful for this are specifically named Practical Sigil Magic by Frater, F-R-A-T-E-R-U-D. This one's going to go into some pretty, solid depth, and I'm going to show you an example of his work, and it is that Frater? Yes. This is my wish, for example, is one symbol. To obtain the strength of a tiger, and then combining those into one sigil. And it goes through very step-by-step in an easy way to understand how to create this specific thing. So I know this might seem a little esoteric, but it goes into great depth in practical sigil magic. This is another example. So you see, this is my wish to burn 500 pounds tomorrow. He's British, obviously. But you can see how it's aligned, and this is the first creation of that sigil. And then because it's so convoluted, simplified down. Further simplification. And it talks about inversion of symbols and how to put them together. Within the next book, Sigil Witchery by Laura Tempest Zakroff is another great one that talks about specifically sigils on the body, for example. This one, I think this might be Frater still. But remember, this is another way to create sigils, and you'll see both of these types. So this specific method and this method are seen in both Zakroff's book, Sigil Witchery, as well as Practical Sigil Magic by Frater U.D. Those two books, specifically Practical Sigil Magic, has been the best foundation to tell you how to make a sigil for yourself and your own operations. And it goes into all the different types and methods within that as well. And then it's up to your imagination how you want to create or craft those for your own witchcraft as well. I was going to get into practicing this, but I'm going to leave you with the practice option. Basically, think of a word of power. So start taking down the So make a simple statement, 3 to 5 words, and then take out all of the vowels, and take out all the duplicates. From that, start putting together those letters that remain into its own phrase. And to make that less difficult to understand from just a spoken perspective, that's this method right here. So this is my wish to earn 500 pounds. This my woe arn f vu dp is removing all of those pieces that were duplicates, or specifically that one was duplicates, it looks like. But to make it more easy, take out duplicates and vowels, and then start working them into a basic shape. And start rotating them, see where they might fit. So instead of a letter A being upright, turn it to the left, and start drafting some of those sigils yourself and see what you might come up with in your own sigil making. I think Practical Sigil Magic is also one of those ones that you are able to get. I think it's free at the moment, but just do some searching on that if you are interested in more of that sigil craft. Does anybody have any questions at this point? You're muted, Tori.
Can you hear me now? No?
You're very quiet, but yes.
So basically, I have done some sigil magic, and I also find that instead of using henna, you can also use body pens.
Good point. Yep. Thank you.
Mhm.
Any other thoughts? Cool. If anybody has any questions or wants more direction or guidance with this, I am happy to provide that as well. I'm going to put in our Discord, I'll put up the resources that I had for some of this that goes into greater detail as well. But like I said, Practical Sigil Magic will be Practical Sigil Magic and Sigil Witchery are two of the most basic core books that I would use for this specifically, that makes it very attainable and understandable and approachable.
That was a lot of information in a very short time.
Yes, I have more. I just had to try and fit this into an hour.
I very much appreciate it. I got 2 pages of notes out of that, and I got a really nice, I got a lot of stuff to work with here. I got exactly what I came here for.
Yep, me too.
Excellent.
It
Yes.
honestly helps a lot with what I already do. So I had already been incorporating Norse runes in along with my letters. So yeah, that.
Excellent. Yep. And just play around with those shapes. And certain shapes you can just stick together too. So if certain shapes have certain meanings, just you can ignore all of the other correspondences and just play with your own correspondences, what you think of a certain shape and what it means to you, and start putting those together. There's even a scribble method that's talked about in the Practical Sigil Magic, where you basically go into auto writing mode. So you close your eyes and you put on some incense and some Pink Floyd, and you just go nuts with a shape on a certain page, and then you look at it, and then you pull out symbols from that, and then create your own sigils from those shapes too. The Discord server, it can be found, there's a link to it on our website, churchofwitchcraft.org, and you can just click on that. Please make sure that you have your verified email, or it will be very hard for us to make you a member, because that's how Discord works. I'm just waiting for a response on that one. Yep, not a problem. And if you have an issue with getting into the Discord, feel free to send us an email. We're at synod@churchofwitchcraft.org, or you can also call us, but all that information is also available on our site and has a contact form for that as well.